Hey guys, in this tutorial we're going to be using the power of Photoshop to remove complex distractions in your photos. You'll see me work with the image that Theresa has submitted to create a distraction-free finished image, using a technique that's quicker and easier than you imagined. Feel free to follow along from start to finish, or you can fast track through the tutorial by following the chapter links below. And as always, please hit subscribe if you'd like to follow me on Learn Pet Photography for more pet photography editing tutorials. G'day, I'm Charlotte Reeves from Learn Pet Photography, and you've tuned into episode 3 of my new series, Edit My Photo. Theresa was the winner of the Edit My Photo challenge. It's a challenge that I run monthly in my Real Shoots Complete course Facebook group. We delved into equine photography for this challenge when I submitted this image of Astrid that I took, my pretty chestnut lady. As usual, there were some great edits submitted, and I chose Theresa's edit because I love the sunshine and vibrancy she brought to the image through her editing choices. As the winner of the challenge, Theresa submitted this photo to me to edit. I love it when my students give me a tricky one because it gives me the opportunity to demonstrate a technique that people might find helpful in their own edits. So without further ado, let's dive into this edit. So here we are with the raw image in Lightroom. Now I'm guessing Theresa has submitted this image to me to see what I will make of all of these distractions in the image. So we've got a leash removal to do, but we've also got some plants and bits of grass and those sorts of things that are kind of distracting because they're sharp, because they're in the same plane of focus as the dog's face. The image is a great base to start with. It's very nicely exposed. You'll see on the histogram here, you've got a good range of tones all the way from the blacks up to the highlights. And it's quite a nice scene too. We've got some woods in the background, but the dog itself is standing in some nice light. So we've got some great catch lights in the dog's eyes. The white fur does look quite bright, but by taking the exposure all the way down, I can see that there is detail in all those highlights there. So we should be able to recover some of that textural detail in the fur. So for now in Lightroom, we're going to just do a basic edit for color and tone and contrast, and then we're going to take the image into Photoshop and see what we can do about removing some of these distractions. So I'll start off just by doing a white balance check. So I'm going to use a little eyedropper here for the white balance. You can also press W on the keyboard, and I'm just going to press on an area of white fur. So when you're photographing dogs that have white fur, and if they're in reasonably clean light, it's actually a really good opportunity to be able to use this tool because it's asking you to select a neutral target in the image, and white fur generally needs to be neutral. So neutral meaning it doesn't have a color cast one way or another. So I'm just going to click on some of this white fur here. And as you can see, it's warmed the image up quite a lot. Now, you might need to do this a few times to get the exact sort of result that you're after. So I'm clicking on the side of the dog, the chest. I'm thinking that the result that I'm getting from the tail is the best because sometimes when you're clicking on the chest, it's actually receiving some color cast bouncing up from the greens and yellows of the grass the dog is standing on. So often a neutral target may be on the top of the dog's head or the dog's tail or the top of their back, anywhere they're receiving clean light. So that's not too bad of a white balance. I am going to just have a little manual tweak with this. It's looking a little green to me, so I'm just going to take that magenta up and just get that temperature, so the balance between blue and yellow, the temperature looking good. Okay, that's looking pretty good. Now I'm going to whip through some other adjustments in the basic adjustments panel here. So I'm going to take the highlights down, and that will help to recover this detail in the dog's fur. So I'm going to take the highlights down, but to stop the highlights from looking too grey, I'm also going to balance that by taking the whites up. That helps to keep contrast in the light areas of the image. So at this stage, I'm just going to press J on the keyboard just to check for blown out highlights. You can see up the top here, we've got some blown out highlights, and you can see the corresponding spike at the right hand end of the histogram that's actually indicating those highlights. Now, something helpful that you can do is you can actually crop the image to remove those highlights, and you'll actually see that spike disappears, magically disappears. That's because those tones basically aren't in that image anymore. So I'm actually just going to, now that I've got the image cropped, just push these bright areas up and make sure I can get that white fur as bright as I can while still keeping detail and not actually blowing out those highlights. So I think that's actually pretty good. Okay, now I can reset that crop because I don't want to throw away any of the image while at this very early stage here. So I'll reset that crop, and as you can see, the spike at the top of the histogram is back again, and that's all those blown out highlights up there, but we're not worried about those. So that's got the highlights sorted out. Now I'm going to have a look at the shadows. I'd like to get a little bit more detail in the dog's eyes and also in the background here. I think we can get some more interest in those shadowed areas. So I'm going to take the shadow slider up, and then to stop those blacks from looking too grey, I'm going to balance that by taking the blacks down a little. So let's have a look at the before and after, just with those adjustments there. So that is only from doing highlights, shadows, whites and blacks, and also the temperature and tint sliders in the white balance section. So that's made a pretty good difference already. Now, because this image is quite nicely exposed and it's quite a nice scene to start with, I'm not really going to have to do too much more in Lightroom. There isn't any major areas to fix. There's not any sort of crazy backlight to deal with. The image has been taken in the shade, so the light is quite soft. So all I'm going to do is add a little extra clarity, a little extra vibrance. I might just boost those reds and oranges in the background a little. I might have to be a bit careful with that though, because the dog also has orange. So let's just see if we can have a play with that saturation. I think that's boosted that a little bit. And the greens, I think I might actually try and reduce the luminance of those greens to see how that's going to look, because I want this image to end up with some beautiful reds and oranges and greens, and we don't want that yellow kind of greenish tone to dominate the image quite so much. So I'm just going to drag down on the luminance and also maybe the luminance of the yellow as well. And that just takes the edge off that really bright yellowy kind of green look that you get. Also makes the image look a little bit more saturated, which is nice. So just another quick checkup. So that's the before, that's the after. I think that's looking pretty good. So the biggest thing now, I guess, is really dealing with these distractions in the image. So the leash, the weeds, all that sort of thing. These bits of grass over on the left here. So we're actually going to go and do that in Photoshop. So let's head over there now. Hey, welcome back. So here we are in Photoshop. We have this image exported from Lightroom as a PSD file, which is my preferred image file format. We have some issues here. We need to get rid of the collar, the leash. I think it's an all-in-one leash and collar here, so it all definitely needs to go. There's a very sharp plant right here that's right next to the dog's face that's very distracting, so that whole plant needs to go. There's some pretty bright tendrils of grass as well that are just kind of picking up the light. And there's also this section over here that needs to go as well because it's quite distracting too. I'm also going to try and see if I can make this foreground section look a little bit less complicated and distracting, I suppose. So probably darken it off, get rid of the really bright areas of grass. So the best way for doing this is definitely using Photoshop's Content Aware. Now, when I first started using Content Aware, I used to use the patch tool quite a lot. And the way that I used the patch tool was to do it in sections. So I would select a section and then drag that over to where I wanted to replace the content from. And that would end up taking quite a while because you'd spend all this time doing selections and then sampling from over here and then maybe fixing it up because it wasn't quite right. Now, with one of the recent updates to Photoshop, you actually have a much better way of doing this, and it's using the Content Aware workspace in Photoshop. Now, I find that Content Aware works best when you try and remove everything that you want gone at once. Do it all in the one hit. So the biggest thing is to start with is making a selection of everything that you want. Now, when you're making a selection, you don't need to use the patch tool. You can use any of the selection tools or any combination of the selection tools. So you've got quite a few different tools you can use in Photoshop. So you've got the marquee tool. You've got a rectangular, elliptical, single row marquee. You've got 4 different options of marquee tools there. You've got the lasso tools, so you've got the regular lasso tool, which works basically the same as the patch tool for selection. Then you've got the polygonal lasso tool, which actually creates straight line edges, which I use a lot. And then you've got the magnetic lasso tool. I don't use that quite as much because I find it's not as accurate as doing it by hand. You've also got other ways of selecting, so you've got magic wand, quick object selection tool, all those sorts of things. But the main ones that I use are actually just the regular lasso tool or the polygon lasso tool. So if I was to make a selection of this bush here and the leash and the sticks and all that sort of thing, my preferred way of doing this is probably actually the polygonal lasso tool. So to use this, you basically just click, 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 click. So if I wanted to make a square, I would just click, 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 and that makes basically a square. So I find this really handy for when you have straight things in the image. So this stick, for example, I would start here, click, 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 you get the idea. And this allows you to very quickly follow the outline of something without actually having to follow it exactly. Now, as I'm getting to this section here, it might actually be quicker switching to the regular lasso tool. So I'm going to just make that into a selection. And you can add and subtract to and from selections as well. So I would switch to the regular lasso tool. I would hold down Shift, and I'm just going to add to that selection. So I'm using a tablet. It's a Wacom tablet, so that makes this kind of stuff a lot easier. I did use a mouse for a really long time. I was so stubborn about switching to one of these, but I'm so glad that I have now because it does make this kind of thing a lot quicker. So if you get a little bit tired of doing that and you're kind of losing it, you can actually go back and sort of commit that extra bit to the selection, and then you can start again. So let me just go around and use the combination of the polygonal lasso tool and also just the regular lasso tool, and I'll finish making this selection of everything that I want to remove from the image. Now you'll probably get to the stage where your selection needs to actually have some bits taken out of it. And to do that, all you have to do is press Option on the keyboard, comes up with a little minus sign on the tool, and then you just subtract whatever it is from that selection. So let me continue refining this selection real quick. Okay, even sped up, that may have looked a little painful, and to be honest, it kind of is, but it saves you so much time in the long run, and I'm going to show you how. So instead of just pressing delete and filling with content aware, which gives you this result, see how it hasn't done a great job in the center here. It's put some sharp bits of grass in an area where that really should be blurry. So instead of doing that, we're actually going to go into Photoshop's Content Aware workspace. So all you need to do is go Edit, Content Aware Fill, and it brings up this workspace. So it's split into basically two panels. So in the left-hand panel, the green overlay shows you where it's grabbing content from to put into the bit that you're trying to get rid of. So the fact that it's selected quite a lot of the dog is really not right. We don't want to put any bits of dog in there. And the fact that it's selected areas where there's sharp grass and bits of background that we don't really want, all of those sections we don't really want it putting in here. And on the right hand panel here, you'll actually see the result if we kept it like that, where it's sampling from basically anywhere and randomly in the image, you're getting repeating patterns. You're getting a not really great result up near the tree here, where the tree meets the greenery. So what we're going to do is refine where it's grabbing content from. So you've got some tools here for this left-hand workspace. This one here, it's basically just a brush, and by default it's set to subtract. So it's a bit hard to see, but there's a tiny little minus sign right in the middle of the brush. So if I paint onto here, it's actually going to get rid of that green overlay. And so it's basically telling Photoshop we don't want to grab bits of image from these sections here. And you'll notice on the right, as I'm doing this, the image on the right is actually updating. And that is going to be our finished result, that image on the right. So we need to get that looking right. So we actually want to get rid of all this sharp grass through here as well. We don't want sharp grass getting put into that nice blurry section there. So we only want blur. We actually don't really want any of the grass from along the front as well. So we'll get rid of that too, because it's just not the right sort of color and texture that we really want. Might actually add a little bit of this grass back in, because it does need that for the bottom of our selection. So if you wanted to add rather than subtract, so you just have to hold down Option and it will add that green overlay back in again. Okay, so having a look over on the right here, it's still getting sharp grass from somewhere, and unfortunately it does look like it's getting it from this section here. So let me just remove that again. Okay, it's got rid of the sharp grass in there now. So we also want to tell it where and where not to select from up here. So we don't want this bit of sharp grass over on the left-hand side here. We don't want that contributing. Okay, on the right there, that's looking a bit better. We do want this bit of tree trunk here. So I'm going to add that all back in again. So that's all good to sample from. It would also, see how that updated there really nicely. We also, this tree trunk here would be kind of good. So sometimes it goes a bit blurry on that right hand panel while it's updating and doing all the calculations that it needs to do the content aware properly. So I'm thinking it's actually looking pretty good over here. I don't think there's really anything in there we don't want. We are going to be able to kind of fix those areas up, I think, without too much problem. So another thing that you can actually do in this panel is you can add to and remove from this selection without having to escape from this workspace. So you've got a little tool up here. It's either the Lasso or Polygonal Lasso tool. So there's the exact same two tools that I was using before. And you can actually refine that selection more, exactly the same way that we were doing before. So if we want to subtract from that to make this a little bit more accurate, we can do that directly from within this workspace. And you'll notice it's gone blank on the right hand side because it's on Struggle Street trying to do all the calculations it needs to do the complex content aware stuff. So I mean, you could fiddle around with this all day. You could really work on refining your selection right in here, but I'm thinking this is giving us a pretty good result over here. So from within this workspace, you also have the option of how you want Photoshop to output the result of what you've been doing here. So output settings over on the right here, you can output to the current layer, you can output to a new layer, or you can duplicate the layer. So we're actually going to output to a new layer. We're going to go, okay. We've still got the selection here, so I can just deselect that. That's actually done a pretty good job. If I were to remove that layer and then put it back again, that's actually really good. So the reason I outputted that to a layer is that just in case I need to do any kind of fixing up here with anything, and just by turning this on and off multiple times, I can see if there's any areas I need to fix up. Now, the area that I'm looking at in particular is over along the edge of the dog here. So because it hasn't done a real fantastic job along there, I'm actually going to add a mask to that layer, and I'm going to grab a black brush And I'm just going to mask out just along the edge here. So I think that's the only bit that I'm going to have to refine a little bit more. Actually, I also wouldn't mind trying to blend this edge a bit more as well. See how it's left a little bit of a sharp line along here. So I'm going to flatten that down, and then I'm going to go in here and try and fix up this edge a little bit better. But first I'm actually going to remove this leash and integrated leash and collar here. So I'm just going to select this area here. And I'm doing this first because it's going to be tricky to get that edge right with this still here. So let's try and see how content aware goes with that. Yeah, it's pretty good. That's pretty good. Always just try it first. You might not even need to go into that content aware workspace. All right, deselecting here. And I'm just going to use the clone stamp tool to do a little bit of fixing up. Now I can have another look at this edge here. So I'm going to use the Polygonal Lasso tool because it is pretty much a straight line. Okay, let's see how content aware does here. So I'm just pressing delete, content aware fill. That's actually not too bad, but it's kind of pushed the edge of the dog out. It's made quite a nice edge, but I think we can probably do better than that. So I'm just going to go back to the selection here before we did content aware. And let me instead just try switching to the patch tool and then clicking and dragging instead. There we go. That's actually created a really nice edge, and it's also put some texture in there. So Photoshop actually does a pretty good job with that sometimes. So just a little bit of fixing up required here. We've got a few stray hairs and things. Cool, I think that's actually created a pretty nice edge there, and it was quite straight to begin with, so I don't think that looks too weird or anything like that. So there's a few bits over here to just do a bit of manual fixing up, just so I don't have any floating bits and pieces that don't make sense. So I'm going to quickly jump in and remove these. Right, so I think we've got the left-hand side pretty well sorted here. I may go back later on and just do some final touch-ups around this sharp grass here. So let's take a look at the left-hand side now. We're going to do pretty much exactly the same process. So I'm going to make a selection first of everything that I want to get rid of, and then we're going to go back into that content-aware workspace again. All right, I think I have everything that I want selected, but we can always fix that up in the workspace. So let's go edit, content aware fill. Once again, we've got this green overlay, and we can see immediately what's happening over on the right-hand side here. So I'm just gonna zoom in a bit more and pan over so we can see. So it's actually done a pretty good job straight off the bat here. I'm not sure there's anything we really need to do other than what it's already done. So you can see with the green overlay, this is where it's sampling from to fill in our selection. It hasn't selected anything weird, which is great. It hasn't selected the dog or any parts of the background that aren't going to match. It's actually done a pretty good job. So let's just go with that. So we'll go output to a new layer. Actually, I'm going to be super confident. I'm actually going to go output to the current layer. I'm that confident. So there's our selection, and let's deselect that, and let's just have a look if there's anything we need to fix up in here. I'm just going to go in with the clone stamp tool and get rid of a few little repeating patterns and things that I see, which is pretty common. Sweet, I think that looks so much better. Let's just have a quick look at the before. So when we brought the image in, look at all that stuff. And then now, look at all those distractions gone. So there's probably a bit more we can do. I'm going to jump in and just do that really quickly. It's just going to be really fine-tuney, sort of finicky kind of stuff. So we'll do that as a speed edit, and then I'll be back and we'll have another look at this front area here and see if we can do something about that. Okay, so as you can see, it's really easy to get carried away with this sort of thing. You pretty much have to draw the line somewhere. And I guess that line for me is when I can look at the image and not be overly distracted by any one particular thing. Now, there's still a few little bright tendrils of grass here. Part of me just wants to get rid of all of them, but the other part of me is like, no, Charlotte, stop. Just stop. So I'm pretty happy with this result here. So we've got the dog quite nicely standing in isolation in a nice sort of clean plane of focus against that blurry background and this foreground here. I think it's actually looking pretty good. So I'm going to take this back into Lightroom and we're going to do a few finishing touches in Lightroom. Okie dokie, so here we are back in Lightroom. I'm just going to show you a quick before and after of when we exported the image from Lightroom and now that we've brought it back into Lightroom after all that crazy work we did in Photoshop. So this was before, Distraction City, as you can see, and this is after. So what do you think? Do you think it was worth doing all that work to this image? For me, I would probably only go to quite this extent if this image was going to be printed large for a client on the wall. That's when I get in and really do all the fine-tuning stuff. If the image was just going to be part of a gallery of images, I probably wouldn't have gone to quite this extent. But this is kind of like a full edit of what I would do if the image were to be printed. Now I'm just going to do a few final kind of things in Lightroom here. So first of all, I'm going to do a crop, and we spoke before about cropping those super bright highlights out. Now, I'm not sure I actually want to crop in quite that close because I kind of like having those trees going off above, and also I don't want to get rid of this really bright red foliage on the right hand side because I think that adds to the image and makes it really pretty. So I'm thinking a crop, and this is why I love cropping in Lightroom, because you can just crop and then undo and then recrop. It's all non-destructive, and you're not actually throwing any of the image away like you do when you crop and save in Photoshop. So I'm thinking that is quite a nice crop. I do want to darken off this foreground a little. I feel like some of this grass here is just a bit distracting. So I'm just going to take a gradient adjustment, pull it up from the bottom to say around here, and then take that exposure down. So darken that off a little bit. I'm also going to take the clarity down as well because that'll help take off any sharp edges and remove distractions once again. So I'm just going to take clarity down there as well. So that's before and after. And I'm also going to do a bit of a custom vignette. So I'm going to grab the radial adjustment tool, I'm going to draw it around the dog in kind of like an oval shape. So I can see what I'm masking or not masking when I press O on the keyboard. So the mask here shows, it's a little bit different to Photoshop. It's not showing the area that's being masked out from the adjustment you're about to make. It shows the area that the adjustment you're about to make will apply to. So if I turn that overlay off and take the exposure down, it's going to actually reduce the exposure around the edges of the image. Now, I don't want to go too crazy with this. I'm also actually going to take the saturation up a little bit too to help bring some of those lovely reds and greens in, but we don't want to affect the dog. So I'm going to take that up. I'm going to take the clarity down a bit because we want to really make that background lovely and soft. Now, just turning this on again, I want to make sure that any of these adjustments aren't actually applying to the dog. So we might need to go in and fine tune this mask. So while you've got the radial mask on, you can go into the brush tool and erase and auto mask, and you can actually paint that mask back off the dog. So we want to make sure these ear tips aren't being included. The dog's tail I'm not quite so concerned about because it's kind of in the background and it's blurry, so it is allowed to have those things applied to it. So let's have a look at before and after. It's just created a nice little spotlight effect. So giving this image a final evaluation here. One thing that keeps dragging my eye towards it is this bit of grass over the dog's front leg. Now, I didn't remove this before because this was my attempt at not going overboard. I thought, you know, it's allowed to have that bit of grass kind of over that section there. But you know what? It's annoying me. So I'm going to hop back into Photoshop and I'm going to show you the final image with that gone. I'd love to know what you guys think. It's really so subjective with this kind of thing. This sort of thing doesn't bother a lot of people, but there's other people like perfectionists like myself who just cannot get it out of their head once they see it. So I'd really love to hear what you guys think about this level of perfectionism, I guess, and whether you think it's worth it, and what sort of extent you usually go to when you're editing your images. So for now, I'm going to stop. That's it. I'm done. This is the end of the edit. Thanks so much for joining me. I hope you've managed to pick up a few new tips and hints and tools maybe that you can use in Photoshop and Lightroom to help improve your pet photography. Tune in next time and I'll see you then. Bye.